What would you do if your life depended on the loyalty of a four-legged friend? Imagine a fire raging through your home, smoke filling every corner, and the only one who can save you is your dog. This is the incredible true story of Max, a golden retriever, and his elderly owner, Evelyn, whose unbreakable bond defied the odds and left an entire community in tears. Evelyn Harper, a 78-year-old retired schoolteacher, lived a quiet life in her cozy suburban home. Her days were filled with gardening, reading, and the constant companionship of her golden retriever. Max wasn't just a pet. He was her family, her confidant, and her protector. But one fateful night, their peaceful life was shattered when a fire broke out in their home. Evelyn, who had limited mobility due to arthritis, was trapped. The flames spread quickly, and the smoke made it impossible to see or breathe. The odds were against her survival. How did Max, a gentle and loving dog, transform into a hero in the face of danger? What drove him to risk his own life to save Evelyn? How did this harrowing experience deepen their bond in ways no one could have imagined? And most important, who is responsible for this? Stay tuned to uncover the secret. Let's begin. Evelyn Harper sat in her favorite armchair by the window, a cup of tea steaming gently on the side table. The golden rays of the setting sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room. At her feet lay Max, her golden retriever, his fur shimmering like honey in the light. His tail thumped lazily against the carpet as he dozed, his head resting on Evelyn's slippers. It had been 5 years since Evelyn adopted Max from the local animal shelter. She still remembered the day vividly, the way he had looked at her with those soulful brown eyes, as if he knew she needed him just as much as he needed her. Since then, Max had become more than just a pet. He was her companion, her confidant, and in many ways her lifeline. Evelyn, now 78, had lived alone since her husband, Arthur, passed away a decade ago. Her 2 children, both living in different states, visited occasionally, but it was Max who filled the silence of her home with his playful antics and unwavering loyalty. He had a knack for sensing her moods, curling up beside her when she felt lonely, nudging her hand when she needed a smile, and even barking at the mailman if he lingered too long at the door. That evening, as Evelyn prepared dinner in the kitchen, Max began acting strangely. He whined softly, pacing back and forth between the kitchen and the living room. Evelyn paused, her wooden spoon hovering over the pot of soup. "What's gotten into you, boy?" she asked, frowning. Max stopped pacing and looked up at her, his ears twitching. He let out a low whimper, his tail tucked between his legs. Evelyn knelt down, her knees creaking slightly, and scratched behind his ears. "You're not hungry, are you?" "I just fed you," she said, trying to soothe him. But Max didn't settle. Instead, he nudged her leg with his nose, his eyes wide and anxious. Evelyn stood up, a faint sense of unease creeping into her chest. She glanced around the kitchen, her gaze landing on the stove. The soup was simmering gently, and the faint smell of smoke wafted through the air. "Oh, the soup!" she exclaimed, rushing to turn down the heat. She stirred the pot, relieved that it hadn't burned. But as she turned back to Max, she noticed he was still restless, his eyes darting toward the hallway. "What is it, Max?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. Max barked sharply, a sound that made Evelyn jump. He rarely barked unless something was wrong. She opened the back door, thinking he might need to go outside, but Max didn't move. Instead, he stayed by her side, his body tense and alert. Just then, the smoke alarm blared, its shrill sound piercing the quiet evening. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the hallway. Thick black smoke was curling out from under the door to the basement, and the faint glow of flames flickered through the cracks. "Oh no," she whispered, her hands trembling. "The fire, it's in the basement." Panic surged through her as she grabbed her phone from the counter. But before she could dial 911, the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. The only light came from the flames, which were now spreading rapidly, licking at the walls and ceiling. Evelyn's arthritis made it difficult to move quickly, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. She stumbled toward the front door, but Max was already ahead of her, tugging at her sleeve with his teeth. "Good boy, Max," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "Let's get out of here." But as they reached the hallway, a loud crash echoed through the house. A beam from the ceiling had collapsed, blocking their path to the front door. Evelyn's heart sank as she realized they were trapped. Max barked again, his eyes locked on hers. In that moment, Evelyn saw something in his gaze, a determination, a refusal to give up. He nudged her toward the back door, but the flames were closing in from all sides. Evelyn's vision blurred as the smoke filled her lungs. She collapsed to her knees, her strength fading. Max stood over her, his body shielding her from the heat. "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't think I can make it." But Max wasn't ready to give up. With a final, desperate tug, he pulled Evelyn to her feet and began dragging her toward the back door. The flames roared around them, the heat unbearable. As they reached the door, Evelyn fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. Max barked urgently, his paws scratching at the wood. Finally, the door swung open and cool night air rushed in. Evelyn stumbled outside, collapsing onto the grass. Max stood over her, panting heavily, his fur singed and his paws raw. The sound of sirens filled the air as the fire trucks arrived, their lights flashing in the darkness. But as Evelyn looked back at her home, now engulfed in flames, she realized their ordeal was far from over. Max had saved her life, but the fire had taken everything else. What would happen to them now? The night air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke as Evelyn lay on the damp grass, her chest heaving, her vision swam, and her ears rang from the chaos of the fire. Max stood beside her, his golden fur streaked with soot and his breathing labored. He nudged her cheek with his nose, whining softly, as if to ask, "Are you okay?" Evelyn reached out a trembling hand to stroke his head. "Good boy, Max," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved me." But there was no time to rest. The fire raged on, consuming the house with a ferocity that seemed almost alive. Flames shot through the roof, sending embers spiraling into the night sky. The heat was unbearable, even from a distance, and Evelyn could feel it pressing against her skin like a heavy blanket. "We need to move," she croaked, struggling to sit up. Her arthritis made every movement painful, and the smoke had left her weak and disoriented. Max seemed to understand. He pressed his body against hers, offering support as she slowly got to her feet. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon, fire trucks screeched to a halt in front of the house. Firefighters leaped into action, unraveling hoses and shouting orders. One of them spotted Evelyn and Max and rushed over. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" the firefighter asked, his voice urgent but calm. Evelyn shook her head, though every part of her ached. "I'm okay," she managed to say, "but my dog, he's hurt." The firefighter glanced at Max, who was panting heavily, his paws raw and bleeding. "We'll take care of him," he assured her, "but we need to get you both away from here." He helped Evelyn to a safe distance, where paramedics were setting up a makeshift triage area. Max stayed close, limping slightly but refusing to leave her side. A paramedic wrapped a blanket around Evelyn's shoulders and began checking her vitals, while another tended to Max, cleaning his wounds and giving him water. Evelyn's eyes never left her home. She watched in horror as the flames devoured everything she had built over the years. The photos of her late husband, Arthur, the books she had collected, the quilt her grandmother had made. It was all gone, reduced to ash and smoke. "Max," she murmured, tears streaming down her face. "What are we going to do?" Max rested his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes filled with a quiet understanding. He didn't have the answers, but his presence was enough to remind Evelyn that they still had each other. As the firefighters battled the blaze, a crowd began to gather. Neighbors stood in their pajamas, their faces pale with shock. Some offered blankets and bottles of water, while others simply watched in silence, their expressions a mix of sympathy and disbelief. One of the neighbors, a young woman named Sarah, approached Evelyn. "Mrs. Harper, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "Is there anything I can do?" Evelyn looked up at her, her vision blurred by tears. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, "but I don't even know where to start." Sarah knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone," she said. "We're all here for you." The words were a small comfort, but Evelyn couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of loss. Her home was gone, her belongings destroyed, and she had no idea what the future held. Just then, a firefighter approached, his face grim. "Ma'am, we've contained the fire, but the house is a total loss," he said. "Do you have somewhere to stay tonight?" Evelyn shook her head. I don't know," she admitted. Sarah spoke up immediately. "She can stay with me," she said. "I have a spare room." Evelyn looked at her, surprised by the kindness. "Are you sure?" she asked. Sarah nodded. "Of course. You and Max are welcome to stay as long as you need." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. As the paramedics finished their checks, Evelyn and Max were helped into Sarah's car. The drive to her house was quiet, the weight of the night's events hanging heavily in the air. Max lay in the back seat, his head resting on Evelyn's lap, while she stared out the window, her mind racing. When they arrived at Sarah's house, she led them inside and showed them to the spare room. It was small but cozy, with a bed for Evelyn and a soft blanket on the floor for Max. "Try to get some rest," Sarah said gently. "We'll figure everything out in the morning." Evelyn nodded, though she knew sleep would be impossible. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she stroked Max's fur. "You're my hero, Max," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Max looked up at her, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. In that moment, Evelyn knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. But as she lay down, her mind filled with questions. Who would help her rebuild her life? How would she recover from this loss? And most importantly, what had caused the fire in the first place? As Evelyn drifted into a restless sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fire was no accident. What, or who, had started it? The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Sarah's spare room, casting a soft glow on Evelyn's face. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of the fire and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Max lay beside her on the floor, his breathing steady, but his paws still raw from the night's ordeal. Evelyn sat up slowly, her body stiff and aching. She looked down at Max, who lifted his head and wagged his tail weakly. "Good morning, boy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the smoke. Sarah knocked gently on the door before entering with a tray of tea and toast. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the tray on the bedside table. Evelyn forced a small smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose," she said. "Thank you for your kindness, Sarah. I don't know what we would have done without you." Sarah waved off the thanks. "It's the least I could do," she said. "Now, eat something. You need your strength." As Evelyn nibbled on the toast, Sarah sat down beside her. "The fire marshal called earlier," she said carefully. "They've started investigating the cause of the fire. They'll need to speak with you when you're ready." Evelyn's heart sank. "Do they think it was intentional?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah hesitated. "They're not sure yet," she said, "but they're looking into all possibilities." Evelyn stared at her tea, her hands shaking. The thought that someone might have deliberately set the fire was almost too much to bear. She had always been a private person, keeping to herself and her small circle of friends. Who could possibly want to harm her? Max seemed to sense her distress. He stood up and rested his head on her lap, his warm brown eyes filled with concern. Evelyn stroked his fur, drawing comfort from his presence. "We'll get through this, Max," she said softly. "We always do." Later that morning, Evelyn and Max returned to what was left of their home. The sight was devastating. The house was a charred shell, its walls blackened and crumbling. The roof had caved in, and the once cozy living room was now a pile of ash and debris. Evelyn stood in the driveway, tears streaming down her face. Max stayed close by her side, his tail tucked between his legs. A fire marshal approached, his expression sympathetic. "Mrs. Harper, I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "We've started our investigation, but it's going to take some time to determine the cause of the fire." Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "In the meantime," the fire marshal continued, "we've secured the area and your insurance company has been notified. They'll be in touch to discuss the next steps." Evelyn thanked him and turned back to the ruins of her home. She felt a surge of anger and helplessness. How could she rebuild her life from nothing? As she stood there, lost in thought, Max suddenly barked and tugged at her sleeve. He led her to a corner of the yard where a small, metal box lay half buried in the dirt. "What is it, Max?" Evelyn asked, kneeling down to pick it up. She brushed off the dirt and opened the box. Inside were a few old photographs, a stack of letters, and a small, gold locket. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. These were some of her most treasured possessions: photos of Arthur, letters from her children, and the locket he had given her on their wedding day. "Max, you found them!" she exclaimed, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. Max wagged his tail, his eyes bright with pride. Evelyn hugged him tightly. "You're my hero, Max," she said. "You always know how to make things better." But as she looked back at the ruins of her home, she knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. She had lost almost everything, but she still had Max, and that was enough to give her hope. As Evelyn and Max began to piece their lives back together, a shocking discovery would change everything. What would they uncover next? The days that followed the fire were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and sleepless nights. Evelyn and Max stayed with Sarah, who had become a pillar of support for them. The community, too, had rallied around Evelyn, organizing fundraisers and donation drives to help her rebuild her life. One afternoon, as Evelyn sorted through the few belongings she had salvaged, Sarah knocked on the door. "Evelyn, there's someone here to see you," she said gently. Evelyn looked up, surprised. "Who is it?" "It's Detective Harris," Sarah replied. "He's leading the investigation into the fire." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was necessary. "Send him in," she said, smoothing her hair and straightening her sweater. Detective Harris was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a kind but serious demeanor. He introduced himself and took a seat across from Evelyn. Max, ever the protector, sat at her feet, his eyes fixed on the detective. "Mrs. Harper, I'm sorry for everything you've been through," Detective Harris began. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you a few questions about the fire." Evelyn nodded. "Of course. I'll do whatever I can to help." Detective Harris pulled out a notebook and began his questions. "Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the fire? Any strangers in the neighborhood or unexpected visitors?" Evelyn thought for a moment. "No, nothing comes to mind," she said. "It was just an ordinary week." "What about your home's electrical system? Had you experienced any issues recently?" "Not that I can recall," Evelyn replied. "The house was old, but we never had any major problems." Detective Harris nodded, jotting down notes. "We've ruled out some common causes, like faulty wiring or appliances," he said. "But we're still looking into other possibilities." Evelyn hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Do you think someone could have done this on purpose?" Detective Harris met her gaze, his expression serious. "We're considering all possibilities, Mrs. Harper. That's why it's important to gather as much information as we can." Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. The thought that someone might have targeted her was terrifying. As the detective continued his questions, Max suddenly stood up and let out a low growl. Evelyn placed a hand on his head to calm him, but his eyes remained fixed on the detective. "Is he always this protective?" Detective Harris asked, raising an eyebrow. Only when he senses something's wrong, Evelyn replied, her voice steady. Detective Harris nodded, seemingly unfazed. He finished his questions and stood to leave. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Harper. We'll be in touch if we have any updates. After he left, Evelyn sat in silence, her mind racing. Max rested his head on her lap, his warm presence a comfort. What do you think, Max? She asked softly. Do you think someone did this to us? Max whined softly, his tail thumping against the floor. Later that evening, Sarah joined Evelyn in the living room. How are you holding up? She asked, handing Evelyn a cup of tea. Evelyn sighed. I don't know, Sarah. It's all so overwhelming. I just want answers. Sarah sat down beside her. I know it's hard, but you're not alone. We'll get through this together. Evelyn smiled faintly. Thank you. I don't know what I'd do without you and Max. As the days passed, Evelyn began to piece together a new routine. She spent her mornings sorting through donations and her afternoons meeting with insurance agents and contractors. Max was always by her side, his unwavering loyalty a constant source of strength. One afternoon, as Evelyn and Max walked through the neighborhood, they passed by the ruins of her home. The sight still brought tears to her eyes, but she felt a renewed sense of determination. We'll rebuild, Max, she said, her voice firm. We'll make a new home. Just you and me. Max wagged his tail, his eyes filled with trust and love. But as they turned to leave, Evelyn noticed something strange. A man was standing across the street, watching them intently. He was tall and wore a dark jacket, his face partially hidden by a cap. Evelyn's heart raced. Max, do you see that? She whispered. Max let out a low growl, his body tense. The man noticed them looking and quickly turned away, disappearing down a side street. Evelyn's mind raced. Who was he? Why had he been watching them? As Evelyn and Max returned to Sarah's house, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. What did the stranger want? And was he connected to the fire? The encounter with the mysterious stranger left Evelyn feeling uneasy. She couldn't shake the image of the man in the dark jacket, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his cap. Max, too, seemed on edge. His ears perked and his body tense as they walked back to Sarah's house. Who was that, Max? Evelyn murmured, more to herself than to the dog. And why was he watching us? When they arrived home, Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She took one look at Evelyn's pale face and immediately set down the knife she was holding. What's wrong? She asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Evelyn sank into a chair at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. There was a man, she began, her voice shaky. He was standing across the street, watching us. Max noticed him too. Sarah's eyes widened. Did he say anything? Did he approach you? Evelyn shook her head. No, he just stared. And when he realized we'd seen him, he walked away. Sarah sat down across from her, her expression serious. We need to tell Detective Harris about this. It could be important. Evelyn nodded, though the thought of involving the police again made her stomach churn. You're right, she said. But what if it's nothing? What if he was just passing by? Better safe than sorry, Sarah replied firmly. I'll call the detective first thing in the morning. That night, Evelyn lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Max was curled up beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg. She reached down to stroke his fur, finding comfort in his steady breathing. We'll figure this out, Max, she whispered. We always do. The next morning, Sarah called Detective Harris, who arrived at the house within the hour. Evelyn recounted the incident in detail, describing the man's appearance and his strange behavior. Did you notice anything else about him? Detective Harris asked, his pen poised over his notebook. Evelyn thought for a moment. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or so, and he was wearing a dark jacket and a cap. I couldn't see his face very well, but he seemed familiar somehow. Detective Harris nodded, jotting down notes. We'll look into it, he said. In the meantime, I'd advise you to be cautious. If you see him again, don't approach him. Call us immediately." Evelyn agreed, though the thought of being watched made her skin crawl. As the days passed, Evelyn tried to focus on rebuilding her life. She met with contractors to discuss plans for a new home, and the insurance company had finally approved her claim, giving her the funds to start fresh. One afternoon, she and Max visited the local animal shelter, where Evelyn had adopted him 5 years earlier. The shelter was hosting a fundraiser, and Evelyn had been invited to share her story. Standing in front of a small crowd, Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat. Max sat at her feet, his tail wagging gently as she began to speak. "This is Max," she said, her voice trembling. "He's more than just a dog to me. He's my family, my protector, and my hero. When our home caught fire, Max saved my life. He refused to leave me, even when the flames were closing in. I owe him everything." The crowd listened in rapt silence, some wiping away tears as Evelyn recounted the harrowing night. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet before the room erupted into applause. After the event, a young couple approached Evelyn. "Your story is incredible," the woman said, her eyes shining. "We've been thinking about adopting a dog, and hearing about Max, well, it's inspired us to take the leap." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's wonderful," she said. "Adopting Max was the best decision I ever made. I hope you find the same joy in your new companion." As she and Max left the shelter, Evelyn felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had lost so much, but she still had Max, and together, they were making a difference. But as they walked home, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding, but the street was empty. "Maybe I'm just imagining things," she murmured to Max. Max let out a soft whine, his ears twitching as if he, too, sensed something was off. As Evelyn and Max approached Sarah's house, they noticed something strange. A package left on the doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. What was inside? And who had left it there? Evelyn and Max stood frozen on the doorstep, staring at the mysterious package. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, and tied with a simple string. There was no label, no return address, just Evelyn's name scrawled in messy handwriting across the front. Max let out a low growl, his body tense as he sniffed the air. Evelyn's heart raced as she glanced around the quiet street. There was no sign of anyone nearby, but the feeling of being watched lingered like a shadow. "Sarah?" Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. "Are you home?" There was no answer. Sarah had mentioned running errands earlier, so Evelyn knew she was alone. She took a deep breath and knelt down to examine the package. Max stayed close, his protective instincts on high alert. Carefully, Evelyn untied the string and peeled back the paper. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface smooth and polished. She hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside, she found a folded piece of paper and a small gold key. Her hands shook as she unfolded the note and began to read. "Evelyn, you don't know me, but I know you. What happened to your home was no accident. Meet me at the old oak tree in Miller Park tonight at 8 p.m. Come alone. Bring the key. A friend." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She read the note twice, her mind racing. Who had sent this? And what did they mean by no accident? Max nudged her hand, his warm brown eyes filled with concern. Evelyn stroked his head, trying to calm her nerves. "What do you think, Max?" she whispered. "Should we trust this?" Max let out a soft whine, his tail thumping gently against the floor. Evelyn knew she couldn't ignore this. The note had mentioned the fire, and she needed answers. But the thought of meeting a stranger in the park at night filled her with dread. She decided to call Detective Harris. When she explained the situation, he listened carefully before responding. "Mrs. Harper, I strongly advise against meeting this person alone," he said. "But if you're determined to go, we'll have officers nearby to keep an eye on things." Just don't let on that we're involved." Evelyn agreed, though her stomach churned with anxiety. She spent the rest of the day trying to distract herself, but her mind kept returning to the note and the key. As evening fell, Evelyn and Max made their way to Miller Park. The old oak tree stood at the edge of the park, its gnarled branches stretching toward the sky. The park was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Evelyn clutched the key in her hand, her heart pounding as she approached the tree. Max stayed close, his ears perked and his body tense. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man from the street, the one in the dark jacket and cap. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Evelyn Harper," the man said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm glad you came. Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling. "What do you want?" The man hesitated, then slowly removed his cap. Evelyn gasped. It was Arthur's nephew, Daniel, a man she hadn't seen in over a decade. "Daniel," she whispered, her mind reeling. "What are you doing here?" Daniel's expression was grim. "I'm sorry for all the secrecy, Evelyn," he said, "but I had to make sure you were safe. The fire, it wasn't an accident. Someone set it deliberately." Evelyn's knees felt weak. "Who? Why?" Daniel glanced around nervously before continuing. "It's a long story, but it has to do with Arthur's estate. There are people who think you have something they want, something valuable." Evelyn shook her head, confused. "I don't understand. Arthur didn't leave me anything valuable." Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded map. "This key," he said, pointing to the one in Evelyn's hand, "opens a safety deposit box at the First National Bank. Inside is something that belongs to you, something that could change everything." Evelyn stared at the map, her mind spinning. "Why didn't you just tell me this before?" "Because I wasn't sure who I could trust," Daniel admitted. "But after the fire, I knew I had to warn you. Please, Evelyn, be careful. These people are dangerous." Before Evelyn could respond, Max let out a sharp bark. She turned to see two figures approaching from the shadows. "We need to go," Daniel said urgently. Now, Evelyn didn't argue. She and Max followed Daniel as he led them through the park, away from the approaching figures. They ducked behind a cluster of trees just as the strangers passed by, their voices low and menacing. Once the coast was clear, Daniel turned to Evelyn. "Take the key and the map," he said. "Go to the bank tomorrow. But don't tell anyone, not even the police." "Not yet," Evelyn nodded, her heart still racing. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. "But why are you helping me?" Daniel's expression softened. "Because Arthur was like a father to me," he said. "And your family. I couldn't let anything happen to you." With that, he disappeared into the night, leaving Evelyn and Max alone under the old oak tree. The next morning, Evelyn and Max went to the bank, the key and map in hand. What would they find in the safety deposit box? And who were the people chasing them? The First National Bank stood tall and imposing in the morning light, its glass doors reflecting the bustling street outside. Evelyn clutched the key and map tightly in her hand, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. Max walked beside her, his tail wagging gently, as if sensing the importance of the moment. As they entered the bank, Evelyn approached the front desk, where a friendly teller greeted her. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Evelyn forced a smile. "I'd like to access my safety deposit box," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. The teller nodded and led her to a private room. After verifying her identity, she handed Evelyn the box. "Take your time," she said kindly before leaving the room. Evelyn's hands trembled as she inserted the key and turned it. The lid of the box clicked open, revealing a stack of old documents and a small velvet pouch. She carefully lifted the pouch and untied the drawstring, her breath catching as she poured its contents into her hand. Out fell a delicate gold locket, the same one Arthur had given her on their wedding day. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears as she opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of Arthur, his smile as warm and loving as she remembered. Beneath the locket was a folded letter, its edges yellowed with age. Evelyn recognized Arthur's handwriting immediately. She unfolded the letter and began to read. Asterisk, my dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. I'm so sorry for leaving you, my love, but I hope this letter brings you some comfort. Over the years, I've kept a secret, one I never wanted to burden you with. My family's estate includes a rare collection of antique coins, passed down through generations. They're valuable, but they've also brought trouble. I've hidden the coins in a secure location, known only to me. The map in this box will lead you to them. Use them as you see fit, my love. Sell them, keep them, or donate them. It's your choice. But please be careful. There are people who will stop at nothing to get their hands on these coins. Trust no one but yourself and Max. I love you, Evelyn. Always have, always will. Arthur, asterisk. Evelyn's tears fell freely as she finished the letter. She clutched the locket to her chest, feeling Arthur's presence as if he were right there with her. Max nuzzled her hand, his warm brown eyes filled with understanding. Evelyn smiled through her tears and stroked his head. We'll figure this out, Max, she whispered. Together, with the map and locket in hand, Evelyn left the bank, her mind racing. She knew she had to find the coins, but she also knew the danger that came with them. That evening, she called Detective Harris and told him everything. He listened carefully, his tone serious. We'll handle this, Mrs. Harper, he said. But you need to stay out of sight until we've secured the coins. Evelyn agreed, though the thought of waiting was agonizing. She and Max stayed with Sarah, who had become their rock throughout the ordeal. A few days later, Detective Harris called with an update. We've recovered the coins, he said, and we've arrested the individuals responsible for the fire. They were after the coins, but thanks to you, they'll never get their hands on them. Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. Thank you, Detective, she said. What happens now? The coins will be returned to you, he replied, but I'd advise keeping them in a secure location. And if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. Evelyn thanked him again and hung up, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. She looked down at Max, who was wagging his tail happily. We did it, Max, she said, her voice filled with gratitude. We kept Arthur's legacy safe. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn decided to sell the coins and use the money to rebuild her home. She also donated a portion to the local animal shelter in Max's name, ensuring that other dogs like him would have a chance at a better life. As she stood in the foundation of her new home, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Max stood beside her, his tail wagging as he looked up at her with those soulful brown eyes. This is our new beginning, Max, she said, her voice filled with hope. And no matter what happens, we'll face it together. Max barked happily, his tail wagging even faster. In that moment, Evelyn knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, their bond would always see them through. Evelyn and Max's story is a testament to the power of love, loyalty, and resilience. If this video touched your heart, please like, comment, and share with someone who needs a dose of inspiration. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, love, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their furry friends. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the darkest moments, there's always a glimmer of hope.